Good morning and welcome to This Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Dr. Michael de Percy, Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Canberra, and I'm standing in for the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Parker, this week. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Michael.
Michelle, it's been a big week in politics once again, and in particular Mr Hockey's valedictory speech. He mentioned a number of reforms that he was unable to implement as Treasurer, and to some extent I'm wondering if he's one of the better treasurers we've never had. But will his departure clear the way for Mr Turnbull to implement some of these major tax and infrastructure reforms?
I think that the Turnbull government will be able to make the case for reform more effectively than the Abbott government did, because neither Tony Abbott nor Joe Hockey was able to sell reform very effectively, and of course, most importantly, they overreached in that first budget. They really bit off far more than was chewable. All that having been said, it's still very difficult to get the voting public these days to accept a robust reform program. It's very necessary for a number of things to be done to help productivity, to help economic growth, but politically there are many obstacles to doing them. Now, the government's going to take a reform program to the election. We don't know how robust that will be, but certainly it will involve tax reform, and there are always losers as well as winners out of tax reform.
And Mr Hockey is off to the US to become the new ambassador to replace Kim Beazley. What sort of ambassador do you think he will make?
I think he'll make a good ambassador. He's experienced, obviously, in politics. In America, they quite like ambassadors to be former politicians. Everyone, therefore, is talking the same language. I think he'll be able to tap into various levels of American politics, and he will have a very strong background, obviously, in international economics, G20 and so on, and that will also help him in the job.
Now, moving toward infrastructure reform in particular, Mr Abbott claimed to be the infrastructure Prime Minister, but it seems that Mr Turnbull is shaping up to be able to do some of the things that Mr Abbott was not able to do. And one of the issues that came up this week was the idea of land tax as being a way to capture the value of infrastructure improvements. And we've seen that Mr Turnbull has assisted Queensland, particularly with the Gold Coast light rail. We've seen the asset recycling in other infrastructure areas being rather effective in introducing new infrastructure. To what extent do you think Mr Turnbull will be able to introduce such reforms as land tax, given that usually this is a state's or territory responsibility?
I wouldn't be betting on land tax, because although the government said it's modelling it, it's a case of keeping everything on the table, as it says, and some of the states have already said they're not keen to go down that route. On the question of infrastructure, it's interesting, of course, that Malcolm Turnbull has this new portfolio of the cities and the built environment. That's very much traditionally Labor territory, and I think that what the coalition will now do is be more competitive on that general ground. Malcolm Turnbull also, of course, is totally flexible on the question of transport and the sort of transport that's helped by the federal government, state transport. Tony Abbott was absolutely ideological about roads only. Malcolm Turnbull, who of course loves trams and trains and sends selfies when he's travelling on them, is equally willing to fund public transport. So in that whole infrastructure area, I think we're seeing a different and a wider debate and a different sort of political contest potentially for the electorate.
What does this mean for Mr Shorten as opposition leader now that Mr Turnbull has taken some of that traditional Labor ground around particularly cities and that built environment? What extent does this limit the options available for Mr Shorten in developing opposition policy?
I think it just makes Bill Shorten's already difficult life even more difficult potentially, because while he has got to some of these areas first, as it were, before the coalition, like public transport, like cities policy, and in other areas, innovation, certain parts of education and so on. Nevertheless, he's now being portrayed as something of a man of the past rather than a man of the future, which is where he wanted to position himself. So it is going to make things trickier in terms of the opposition not just formulating policies but making sure that it can differentiate itself from the government in these areas and then sell those policies more effectively.
And speaking of the future, the proposal by Warren Entsch this week that legislation for same-sex marriage should be voted on before the election. Do you think that Mr Turnbull will endorse this strategy?
I think that Malcolm Turnbull is attracted to that strategy, but it is something that's going to be quite hard for him within the party. The idea would be that you'd pass this legislation, but you'd make the implementation of it contingent on a plebiscite being carried next term. Now, that would give a reassurance to those in favour of same-sex marriage that the issue won't be just put off indefinitely. But on the other side, the Conservatives in the party, who really feel very strongly against this issue, think that that means that it gives an advantage to the pro-same-sex marriage case, and they're very against that sort of triggering legislation. How it all works out's not clear. Malcolm Turnbull said this week he would take the matter to Cabinet, and obviously it's going to be battled out in the party room after that if he goes down that path or wants to go down that path.
To what extent has the Conservative stronghold in the Liberal Party been weakened with Mr Turnbull's ascension to the Prime Ministership?
Oh, it's definitely been weakened, and many people who in the middle, as it were, ideologically would say, well, Malcolm Turnbull's obviously lifted our vote, he's doing well, and therefore would be very supportive of him. Nevertheless, there is this Conservative group, and the point is they feel very strongly about some key issues, and same-sex marriage is one of those issues. So we saw this week that as soon as this option of triggering legislation was raised, there was an immense backlash, or a noisy backlash I should say, from some of those Conservatives, and they would certainly marshal their forces, and of course they have support from a strong anti-gay marriage lobby in the community.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And that's This Week with Michelle Grattan. Professor Stephen Parker will be back next week. And until then, we'll see you next time.